All right, looks like most, there are still a few people in the waiting room, and then they'll be entering. And as Jeff said, we may have people entering and perhaps coming and going, but we should probably begin. So my name is Jason Yaremko. I'm with the History Department and Access Education at the University of Winnipeg. And would like to welcome you all to Dr. Aimée Craft's talk, Treaty 1, Understanding the Sharing Relationship After 150 Years. To begin, on behalf of the Teaching History Institute, the History Department at the University of Winnipeg, I wish to acknowledge that we live and work on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Assiniboine, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Métis nations. We also acknowledge that the discipline of history has been used to support programs of dispossession and assimilation directed against Indigenous people. And teaching and learning Indigenous histories allows us to confront colonial history as well as honor and respect the people who have called this place home for millennia. This is also Treaty 1 territory, and Aimée Craft is an Indigenous Anishinaabe-Métis lawyer, scholar, and artist from Treaty 1 territory here in Manitoba. She received her BA from the University of Manitoba, her law degrees from the University of Ottawa and University of Victoria, and also, I believe, University of Manitoba. She's currently an associate professor at the Faculty of Common Law, University of Ottawa. Her expertise is in Anishinaabe and Canadian Aboriginal law, and she is an award-winning teacher, researcher, and writer in the area of Indigenous laws, treaties, and water, among other areas of Indigenous epistemology, relationships, and sovereignty. Professor Craft co-leads several major research grants on decolonizing water governance. Two examples of her excellent and important work include the award-winning book, Breathing Life into the Stonefort Treaty, which focuses on understanding and interpreting treaties from an Anishinaabe or legal perspective, and also Treaty Words, a children's book that explores treaty relationships. Voted one of the top 25 most influential lawyers in Canada, Professor Craft's recent awards include the prestigious Canadian Bar Association President's Award. She's also former director of research at the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, founding director of research at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and a tireless worker with many Indigenous peoples on land, resources, human rights, and governance. Please welcome Dr. Aimée Craft.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I appreciate also the invitation, and thank you for extending that to me and introducing me today, Jason. Where to start? I think some of you are joining us from many different places in Canada. So I just want to say, I do appreciate so much, Jason, the introduction, but also the land acknowledgement and the situatedness that you did in bringing us to the space of, as a historian, as someone who's teaching history, you know, the role that history and the teaching of history has had in perpetuating forms of colonial violence. And I think that's such an important piece of how we approach things that have historical dimensions and think about their application in a current context. And what I wanted to talk about today in the roughly 30 minutes that I have and then engage in the discussion with you all is thinking about how we apply some of these moments in history to our current circumstances. And one of the things we need to deeply take into account is how we understand, interpret, and implement treaties today. And as many of you will be aware, Treaty 1 is 150 years old as of August of this past year. And I think, you know, collectively we can agree that we haven't done a very good job at adhering to the relationship that was built in 1871, or the intention that was made in 1871. So I'll encourage each of you to think about, you know, what is the context in which you're situated and how you have responsibility to those understandings, those interpretations, but also those implementations and applications of relationships. Because at their core, treaties are about relationships, their building of relationships on the basis of mutual recognition of self-determination and autonomy. And when you read written texts of treaties, you're not going to get much of that because it's a one-sided writing. If we looked at contract law, we'd say these are void contracts. If we looked at international law, we would talk about the inaccurate reflection in the document of the intentions made by nation states or sovereign peoples. But I think we've all agreed, and the Supreme Court has even told us that treaties between Indigenous people and the Crown have their own unique nature, and we can't simply look to other areas of law to understand them or interpret them. So they're unique in that sense, and they're unique to the territory in which they arise out of. This is one of the things that I spent a lot of time considering when I was doing my graduate work, is whether or not to use Treaty 1 as a case study, but to really write in a way that would have broader application or implications. And I think that the book that I wrote, Breathing Life into the Stone Fort Treaty, sets the possibility of interpreting and understanding treaties from all of the different regions and different perspectives in their own way, using Indigenous laws and legal orders as the basis of that understanding. But it really did focus in on Treaty 1. And I don't regret that choice, because I think it was important to distinguish that context and say others can do this, but every treaty arises out of a particular way of making relationships. So even if a written text is very similar between treaties 1 to 11, we still have these very unique negotiated agreements and circumstances. One of the things that I tell people that surprises them all the time is that the Anishinaabe of our territory asked for treaty, asked to make treaty. And that's very different from this, colonial perception and what has even been articulated through historical research in earlier years, that, treaties were really the purview of the Crown, and that Indigenous people didn't have much agency in them. And I kind of flip that and argue, along with many others and generations of scholars, including Jean Friesen, who is a great scholar on Treaty 1 and who laid a very important path in terms of speaking to the agency of Indigenous people in treaty making. And that's added to all of the oral history and the understanding of treaty that comes from the descendants of treaty makers as well. And that's essentially what the book tries to do, is listen to those voices and bring them together in a way that articulates that Indigenous law was present in the treaty making. It's part of the treaty relationship that was made. And it's also part of how we need to understand treaty relationships today as relationships of sharing. And Treaty 1 is a prime example of that a relationship of sharing in the land is what was established, and one of non-interference and recognition of self-determination. And it's, knowing that and kind of working from that basis, it makes very interesting points of entry into a variety of other things that we can think about teaching. I use Treaty 1 as a point of entry into UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, showing that idea of self-determination was so deeply built into the treaty making process and the treaty itself through principles of non-interference, that this international instrument is a continuation of Indigenous sovereignty that existed prior to contact and continued through treaty making and the building of a relationship. A lot of people will say, well, why don't we do away with the treaties and start over? Or, if there's been such poor implementation, what is the relationship that is meant to be preserved? What is it that we're trying to continue to achieve? And one of the examples that I give is, marriage vows. And not everyone will identify or associate with this example, but the idea that, you set out with a set of intentions, and even though things go awry, the intention that you've made and the promises that have been made are those original promises. And whether or not you choose a different path collectively, individually, doesn't negate that original formation of a relationship and the promises that are made in that. And hopefully that's a point of entry for at least some of you in understanding what those promises are. And adding in an Indigenous context, the idea that those promises are engaging with the Creator and have spiritual dimension, which some of the marriage promises have as well, adds a whole other connotation to it. So again, not focusing on contract law as ways of interpreting and understanding or international law, but really bringing it into, what's unique about these relationships. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I prepared, but I think I'm just not going to use it if that's, I think that having, although I can't see most of you, and if you want to turn your cameras on, I'm more than happy to see you. But I think I'll maybe stray a little bit from the presentation itself. One of the things that I think came out of the work that I've done on treaties, sitting with elders for many years, trying to understand this work, doing the graduate work, trying to bring together treaty and legal theories, was that I had to kind of ground myself in a way that I could express this back to the community, but also to a wider audience. And that's one of the things that I'm very grateful for, is that Breathing Life into the Stone Fort Treaty has made its way into classrooms, into book clubs. I love hearing from book clubs that have read the book and engaged with it. But I did feel that there was this, this audience that was being missed, and that's children. And I worked extensively with the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba and some of the elders in oral history work and presentations through the Speakers Bureau. And I found that I really loved being in the classroom with younger children, because when I started to share with them the issues with treaty implementation, their horror and disgust at the way we've actually dishonored treaty relationships was very, they had very astute reactions to what it is that I was sharing. And I thought that they probably needed to have something that was directed to them, but also had the good fortune of putting out sort of a smaller text called Treaty Words for As Long as the Rivers Flow, to a literary journal that then got picked up and transformed into a children's book. So it ended up working out really well. And this little children's book, Treaty Words, As Long as the Rivers Flow, talks about treaty theory and how to, well, it's not marketed that way. I don't think many 11-year-olds would say, Mom, can you buy me a book about treaty theory? Or that parents would show up and say, hey, here's your treaty theory book. But there is pretty deep philosophy in the book, but it's beautifully illustrated by Luke Swinson. And the story kind of hopefully resonates with many as them being able to place themselves as the main character. And what this main character does is observe all of these relationships that are part of creation and understand how those informed treaty making, how we modeled the way we made treaties based on reciprocity and renewal and respect, and that all of those things worked their way into how we made treaties with the Crown and made space for settlers in the conception of creation. And how everything has its place and everything has its interaction with all of these other beings that ultimately follow those same core principles. So I love the book because it tells a story of a young girl who's exchanging with her grandfather. And it was so neat because my niece and I did the book launch for this, and we sat together. I asked her to read part of the book, and she did say to me, is the main character me? And which I thought was really cute, because most people ask if it's me, but she thought it was her, that she was the main character in the book. And what I hope is that, you know, every young Indigenous person will see themselves as the main character in this book, and that even non-Indigenous kids will see themselves in parts of this character, right? Being able to listen to the river, to be present in their surroundings. Whether you're in, you know, remote or rural environments or in the city, you know, it's there's always an opportunity. And just before we did that book launch, I was walking by the Assiniboine River with my niece in the city, and we saw an otter, which I didn't even think there were otters in the city of Winnipeg. But so we had this little interaction with an otter, and it just was very appropriate in terms of understanding, you know, what's our part in creation and how we can connect to it in all of these different spaces. Some are asking if I can share parts of the PowerPoint presentation, and I'm happy to do that. And I'm also looking forward to our conversation and your questions a little bit later. So I will jump into the PowerPoint presentation, but it will be, I'm going to run through it and maybe spend a little bit more time on some pieces rather than others. Okay, now you get to see. Okay. So I think it's important also to think about where we are, and I mentioned that very early on, but we're in Western Canada, a very particular context of the numbered treaties. And I think we're going to see the anniversaries of the numbered treaties coming up, and opportunities to really engage in deeper understanding. And treaties are protected in the Canadian Constitution. I think that's an important piece of Canadian history learning, but also understanding this Indigenous perspective that should have what the courts have said is equal footing with Canadian interpretations. And there are a variety of other duties and obligations that arise. I really don't feel like this presentation is the right one for today, but like I said, we'll do parts of it. One of the things that I do want to note is, in terms of Treaty 1 in particular, we have this scattered understanding of the history of it from written documents. And that's, if you're communicating to your students one thing, I think it would be to say that these oral versions of the treaty and understanding treaties from Indigenous perspectives are incredibly significant. And we're at a moment in time where we still have the opportunity to deeply engage with those, but that opportunity won't exist forever. And thinking of different ways of researching. So there's so much you can do in a classroom when you're thinking about how to work with treaties. One is thinking about orality. One is thinking about dueling perspectives, thinking about colonial interpretations, imbalances of power. And we can think about the connection with Canadian law currently, and thinking about them in complex historical contexts, right? Treaty 1 is arising just after the creation of Manitoba. And there's actually a division amongst the Anishinaabe and Métis. The Anishinaabe don't participate in the resistance because they want to win the favor of the Crown and negotiate a treaty. They want their own particular terms. And this is arising in a context of, you know, Western expansion, creation of a railroad, and, you know, pretty significant economic pressures and settler pressures in the territory. I always love to show this image because there's two images of the negotiation of Treaty 1. And those of you who you know, are trying to find materials, it's not always easy to find original source materials, and very few from an Indigenous perspective until very recently. But if we look at this one, I love this. I always ask people, have you been to Lower Fort Garry? And maybe just by a show of hands, can Can you show me who has been to Lower Fort Garry? That's where Treaty 1 was negotiated. And so a few of you, yeah, it's in Manitoba, north of the city of Winnipeg. So quite a few. Okay, so I'll ask you, do you recognize in the background that chain of rolling hills? You can see behind the factor's house there that, those hills. Beautiful, but an absolute misrepresentation. There are no hills in that region. If you look out from the stone fort, all you see is plain prairie. It is as flat as you can imagine. And so to think that, the two visual representations of the historical account, I think these are two images that were commissioned to commemorate the making of the treaty. One of them has a gross factual inaccuracy built right into it. And it may seem insignificant, but it makes you also question, the written text and the written accounts in the transcripts. And in large part, the work that I did was very challenging because what I was trying to do is take the oral interpretations, Anishinaabe legal principles, and the archival record, and kind of try to bring them together in ways that gave us a sense of what Anishinaabe negotiated at that point in time. I'm just going to close the door. There's a lot of background noise here. My apologies. And so even in the written record, we see these very short summaries of what the chief said, speaking with great flourish. And then there's a ... open-ended, we don't really know what was said, or very brief summaries of, some of the Anishinaabe orators going on, but no description, and certainly not an accurate description of what they've said. So thinking about, that today, we need to revisit what the intent was. There's certain things that we see here, like, for example, the staff and the pipes, and the idea of sitting in separate spaces, but it's very different from this first image of the same negotiations. And here we see, people sitting on the outside. There's a canopy instead of in the factor's house. And we don't really understand the differences between the contexts in which these images were captured. But certainly thinking about these as, opportunities to critically engage with what it is that we think that we know about how treaties were made. There was, over 40 years ago, a text called Wavang, Our Tomorrows, that was written by Dave Christine Sr. And, he had hoped that there would be this opportunity to come back together and live in harmony, and live in the coexistence relationship of brotherhood or kinship that was his understanding of the treaty. So all of this is pretty much detailed in the book. And for those of you who teach in law, you might want to pick up on some of the ideas of having a difference between procedural and substantive law, and the different elements of how we do things being just as important as the values and principles that inform what it is that we do. And that's a core part of the understanding that comes from that book. And I think that applies again today when we think about how we do things is just as important as what it is that we do. And honoring that sharing relationship means that relationships developed around communication and sharing and decision-making are really significant in terms of that process. One thing that I would note also is in grounding all of this in Indigenous laws and legal orders, we need to understand that we're coming from deeply different places in terms of what the law has to offer. And at the time of building the Stone Fort Treaty, making the Stone Fort Treaty, Western legal concepts that were brought forward by the commissioners and the treaty negotiation party were based in Western laws that have as pillars individualism and the protection of private property. And so that's on the right-hand side of my screen, hopefully yours as well. On the left, these are the pillars of Anishinaabe law. So building relationships and ensuring Minupimatsuin, or collective well-being. So if you contrast the two, if you look at them side by side, you can see that we're coming from deeply different places in terms of the intention. And the written text of the treaty is basically a set of instructions that was given to the commissioners as they left Ottawa. So I like to think of it as a neatly folded up paper that was in the back pocket of the commissioners that they ultimately took out at some point and had signatures put on it or X's put onto it. It's definitely not a reflection of all of the things that were discussed over the 9 days of negotiations and extensive negotiations. What's interesting about the Treaty 1 negotiations is that they failed, and somehow overnight something changed and the treaty was made. And what we don't know is, what that change was. And I think that in itself should be a significant flag. One of the activities that I like to do with my students in law school is actually ask them to think about, from a negotiations perspective and a dispute resolution perspective, what could have possibly happened to change the minds of the Anishinaabe at that point in time. And there's a central figure, James McKay, that says, I'm going to go talk to them. And somehow everything gets resolved magically. We don't know what the magic of that is, but I think that there are some promises that are made that are not included in the text of that document. And Treaty 1 actually had outside promises that were written about by the treaty party, the commissioners for the Crown party, and they were then communicated, and it became the subject of a renegotiation, a reopening of Treaty 1 to include the outside promises 4 years after the original treaty making. So we've got, like I said, these two different foundations, and one place that it plays out pretty significantly in the negotiations, and I think I'll probably end on this, and then we can move to some discussion, is in invoking a concept of kinship. And we need to think about the treaty as kinship still today, relationships of sharing and kinship. And that's what that Wabung document was talking about, that brotherhood, because the treaty itself was made with the Queen as a representative, as mother. And the treaty commissioners and the Anishinaabe did talk about the Queen as a mother. The commissioner said the Queen recognizes you as her children, acknowledges that the Anishinaabe did not participate in the resistance with the Métis, and says, we're really grateful that you didn't, and you are good children, is the language that's used in the negotiation. And that relationship to mother is so significant in the building of the treaty relationship. And if you look at the slide that's in front of you, what the commissioners are thinking, what they import with them from their colonial thinking, their Western thinking, and their Western legal orders, is this conception of mother, where mothers or parents decide that older children have different rights than younger children, male children have different rights, that children are the property of their parents. And so they're grounding this idea that children have no legal personhood. They're not entities other than as related to their parents, and parents decide. When you think about it from the Anishinaabe perspective, though, the chiefs are agreeing and saying, yes, the Queen, our mother. But what they intend by that mother-child relationship, and it's said in the negotiations that there's an equality amongst all her children, that they will be treated equally, and that no one is higher or lower than any of the others, and that children actually are complete beings. They're legal entities as of the moment that they're born, or even before they're born in Anishinaabe conception, and that the mother's duty is to foster the autonomy of her children. And how we translate that today is in self-determination, right? So giving the child everything that they need to be an autonomous person. So there isn't a magic age like there is in Western law. You turn 18, you're now a person. You can do all these things. You can vote, you can consume alcohol. 16, you can apply for a driver's license. There's no such thing. It's really individualized, and everything is done to foster autonomy of the child. So when we see, the image of the handshake of the treaty medal, I always imagine the chiefs and the commissioners shaking hands and saying, we're making this agreement with our mother. But what they have in their minds is so deeply different. And so they agree on the same concept. And mother is a universal concept, but the normative values that we import with that can be so different. And that's an opportunity, I think, in your classrooms to teach treaties, as relationships of sharing between different people, but it's also an opportunity to think about, differences, cultural differences more broadly. So I think often teachers are very intimidated by the idea of teaching treaty. And, as though it's this very static thing, and that it's a piece of history, and that it's delicate and it's uncomfortable for some. But I actually think that treaty is, because it's relational, is such an opportunity to engage with a variety of different discussions. What is kinship? What are promises? What is orality? What is cultural difference? What are different normative values? What does it mean to share? And this can be, from kindergarten into university, picking up on some of those themes. So I like to think of treaty actually as a methodology. I think there's a whole lot to deeply understand about treaty, and I'm not suggesting that that isn't also a very important task, especially at this point in time, 150 years into Treaty 1, and thinking about the future of how we live together. But I think it's also a very interesting and important methodology. It also helps us understand connections in the environment and how decisions are made, and how anthropocentric our society is, and how we can move away from that into better understanding the roles and responsibilities of other parts in creation, and understanding also Indigenous people's special relationship with their lands and territories. So I think there's so much there. It's so incredibly rich, and that hopefully we can all find ways of engaging with that as we share our knowledge, and encourage younger people to be developing their own critical thinking around treaty relationships and coming up with implementation plans. That's one of the things that I do with law students as well, is ask them to consider the multiple interpretations and come up with an implementation plan for the treaty. And they find that very challenging. And I ask them to represent different parties, and inevitably no one ever wants to represent the crown in these negotiations. But I think it's a really important exercise for everyone to understand that this needs to be a huge part of what we discuss in the Canadian context, if we're going to even move forward in any way with reconciliation, which is a mandate that we've all collectively been given by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I know we want to save time for questions, so I'll turn it over to our hosts to help with that discussion. So Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kraft. I will pass the torch here on to my co-host, Linda Connor, of Education in Manitoba. Linda, are you there?
Yeah, and Miigwech, thank you, Aimée. It was always enlightening. I met you through your book, Stone Treaties, and your words have resonated with me in my teaching career. So thank you. I see, Jen, you have your hand up. I don't know whether you left it up when the question was asked, how many of you have been to where the stone treaties to Lower Fort Garry. So Jen, could you see if do you have a question?
I don't, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Kevin? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kraft. I have a bit of a specific question. I teach high school in Selkirk, so just down the road from the Stone Fort. And I'm wondering if, is there a difference when we're teaching about treaties to our students, specifically for kids in Selkirk? Is there a difference between teaching about the numbered treaties, say, as compared to something like the Peguis-Selkirk Treaty? Are there different ways of approaching those two treaties, or are they sort of one and the same in terms of how you talk about relationships?
That's a great question. I think I like to put them in context. I think they have a very particular moment in time in which they arise. And I think the Selkirk Treaty shows the reliance of non-Indigenous people, settlers, on Indigenous people. You capture a moment in time, and context is so important. I would say that the place where you bring them together, though, is in actually seeing the land. So if you can take your students out to see the territory and think of the overlap of promises that are made in 1817 and 1871, and contrasting that, how there's a change in political climate, there's a different political and geographic pressure on Anishinaabe at the time. I think, tackling things like the ideas of mobility within the territory, who is who. Right now, we kind of point to, we've the Peguis people that are now in Peguis, Manitoba, but the connection to Selkirk. And then even within that, the huge mobility that existed in 1871 and prior to, how people belong to different spaces. And that's why in the PowerPoint too, I have that map of the postage stamp province, because you can actually see how that corresponds to the Treaty 1 territory. But the Treaty 1 territory doesn't sit neatly on the boundary of the postage stamp province, because it wanted to extend into timber territory just outside of the province, but also was defined by water boundaries. So if you think of water and treaties kind of cutting across the middle of rivers, it's interesting. And if any of you teach in geography or blend history and geography, pull up some old maps, topo maps, and see how rivers change then and today, and use Google Earth, right? You can bring in some really interesting teaching methodologies and say, these boundaries of treaties actually are very unstable. They're not as fixed as one might think that they are. And why the Crown would choose to use water as boundaries is, I think, very interesting. I think what they were trying to do is make it relatable and more certain, because none of the land was surveyed. So that gives you another point of entry into thinking about survey and how that creates the Métis resistance. Like all of these different pieces are connected, and so I think there are ways to teach them together, but also separately in terms of their context, and thinking about also from the Indigenous perspective, questions of power and agency. In 1817, you're looking at almost exclusively an Indigenous population. And a lot of questions around 1871, people have said, being Indigenous people being forced into making treaty. And it's like, there's actually a huge number of Indigenous people. If the Métis and Anishinaabe had allied together in the resistance, we can imagine the imbalance of power on the Indigenous, the collective Indigenous side, versus the Canadian state's power in that context. So, and then that you can relate to Batoche and what it is to bring the Cree and Métis together, 14 years later. and what that mounts as a resistance to the Canadian state rights. So it's all, I'm sorry, it's a very long-winded response, Kevin, but one of the things that I think is so powerful is being able to tell stories in ways that are critical and that bring together a variety of different sources, and sort of getting your students not to think of sort of one interpretation or one seminal text on something, but what are the different views and what are the disagreements that exist, and how have things evolved over time. I know we probably want to get to another question, Linda, but there's lots more we could say. And I like also talking about the sort of the generations and thinking about treaties, sort of the generations in academic thinking. And I go back to Stanley and get my students to read part of that, because that's a way of thinking that doesn't reflect where we're at societally today, but then they have a sense of why the ship has steered in the wrong direction over time.
Thanks. I think many of the teachers have, you're transforming their thinking, and they're thinking big, just as you are, and making links between all these concepts. And so, for example, Kelly was wondering, what other concepts would you recommend? And also Daniel was, Alan was wondering if you could post or share a string of sample questions in our curricula. We refer to them now as the essential questions, and they're very helpful for teachers, or if you could recommend a place that teachers could go. And lastly, Daniel was just asking where to go beyond textbooks, especially when you're teaching law.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of, I'm shamelessly going to self-promote the Breathing Life book. And I've never actually referred to it as my book. I've called it the book, right? And it's not the book in the sense that it's the only one, it's an interpretation. But looking at a variety of different sources, and you're dealing with students that are in media world, right? So they like things that have audio-visual components. And there's a ton of recorded oral history. And there are really significant resources that are available online that will help with treaty understandings and hearing from the first person from elders in terms of that understanding. So there are more and more resources that are available, but I think if you're designing around some core questions, you want to think about situating the person in the relational, right? Situating your students, asking them, what's your role in relation to this? What's your responsibility? Who are you? Where are you from? Where do you live? What's your relationship and responsibility to this land? And, that's what I was saying, Kevin, taking your kids out onto this territory, and, even seeing the space in which the Treaty 1 was made, it can be a very powerful, embodied and transformative experience. And trying to ask people to then step outside of themselves and into the role of another, whether that's comfortable or uncomfortable for them, it can be quite transformative and an important educational experience. So I would say that those are the core questions. And I don't know if you would call it a methodology in teaching, but understanding things through that relational lens, and then engaging with the harder conversations about, how not being in that relational space has had significant negative impacts over time. I think that there's a huge opportunity to teach about colonial policy in relation to Indigenous people. And to the question of beyond textbooks, I would say you have amazing resources in documents that I use all the time: the TRC final report, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of Manitoba, and the Inquiry into Murdering Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. And added to that, the Donald Marshall Inquiry, the Ipperwash Inquiry in Ontario, the Starlight Tours Inquiry, and the Neil Stonechild Inquiry in Saskatchewan. These are places in which you'll see the contrast between Crown views, sort of strict legal interpretations, and real life impacts as narrated by Indigenous people, and understanding how that colonial policy has impacted individuals. So I would go outside of textbooks, actually, in large part.
Thank you. And I see Jen has her hand up, and Alan. So I don't know whether we have time. I think we're going over just a little bit, but Jen, if you'd like to ask your question.
Sure. So I teach grade 1-2 at Margaret Park School. So I'm way over in Northwest Kildonan, and we're quite close to Frog Plains. And my school focuses a lot on outdoor education and place-based education. And we found a lot about on the side of the colonizers' perspective about who owned what land and where they were. And we couldn't find a lot about where the Indigenous people lived at the same time. And I'm wondering if you know of any documents that would be helpful in locating that information.
That's a good question. I'm not sure, to be honest. And maybe others would have a response that you can add to the chat. If you were in a high school context, I'd say get them to do some research on this and take them to the archives and try and get them to engage. But if you're in that younger years, I don't know.
Yeah, I'd go to the archives. I think that's a great place to start, and work with an archivist to help show you some of the maps that they have, that I've seen them when I've worked with them on other assignments. So, and Alan, your question, please.
Yes, I was asking about Amy's questions, and she fired off like 3-word questions. I'm not talking about academic or curriculum questions, but she was talking about, having discussions with kids in elementary school, probably. And she just had a number of very simple questions, and she did them so quickly I couldn't get them written down.
I think if I'm correct, they're the questions that Justice Marie Sinclair asked, the 4 main questions. Who am I? Where am I from? Where am I going? And help me with the last one. What do I want to become? I think it's, yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't really quoting from Justice Sinclair, but understanding, who you are and what is your role in, and what are your relationships. So where do I come from? Where am I? And understanding a lot of this in territorial relationship, right? So I commented right at the beginning, I really appreciated what Jason said in the introduction, in not just acknowledging the land, but acknowledging your role as a historian, acknowledging the role of the discipline, the academic discipline in, and the responsibility that you have now in your department, and in changing some of that narrative that's been imparted. And so really understanding, role and responsibility, and in relation to others, because I think sometimes we take those questions and we think about them sort of in our own microcosm, but when you think about those in relation to others, it changes how you see where you are. And those are the questions that I was suggesting, for students to think about is, but this introspection that's relational, and there's a lot of skill building there too.
Yeah, those are very important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to Brenda also for putting in some other questions that you asked earlier. What does mother mean, and what does it mean to share? We just want to remind everyone, we can stay on a few more minutes, but remind everyone that the keynote does begin at 11:45. So make sure you remember to sign in to that presentation. And any other questions? I love it when we come to these sessions because when you ask questions, we want to go further and go on. There's so much exploration to do. So we really appreciate the road you've taken us on, Aimée, to help us gain a deeper understanding with our students. Jason? Yeah.
Thank you again, Aileen. I just want to ask you a question. Something you raised about when it comes to interpreting treaties or the interpretation of treaties, and the question of cultural misunderstanding. This is something that you're probably aware of. Sheldon Krasowski has raised in his book, No Surrender. And I wonder if about your thoughts on his analysis or critique of the notion that what we're talking about here in the context of treaty negotiations was not cultural misunderstanding. There was a clear understanding, but it was more of a case of federal government acting on bad faith, in that they understood what was being negotiated, but they at the same time manipulated those negotiations, and so that, you know, we're talking about more than just cultural misunderstanding when it comes to this, excuse me, this discrepancy between what was negotiated and what ended up on paper. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
I think that's a very, I'm going to give you a nuanced answer because I'm a lawyer. So I think in terms of, you know, what's, what we have evidence of. And I think it's hard to, I think we can assume that there was at least some level of quote unquote bad faith, but the law actually tells us in Canada, the Canadian common law, that we presume the honor of the crown. So in my work, I look at everything through a legal lens, right? And so thinking about that, the presumption of the honor of the crown, if you were to presume that, even in that, there is a level of misunderstanding. What the law also tells us is that we should try and find a common intention. And so that's, you know, those are the baselines that are set in terms of legal thinking: common intention and presuming the honor of the crown. So I probably come in a little bit in the middle of the road between that and Sheldon's work that says, you know, bad faith on the part of the crown, because what I want to in many ways articulate has nothing to do with the crown. It has to do with what Anishinaabe understood themselves to be negotiating, and that the crown's intent, in my view, is less significant than the Anishinaabe intent, because that is what makes the treaty. That's what is, you know, if you void that understanding, to me, then the treaty relationship, regardless of the intent of the crown, becomes void, and then there's no legitimate settler presence in the territory. So to me, weighting things towards the Anishinaabe understanding is the most significant, important part of how we are to understand and now implement treaties today. I don't know if that's enough of an answer for you, but I think it is in part, you know, it's in part discipline, coming at it from the legal perspective, but also I think it's an Indigenous perspective in saying, I don't care what the crown wanted or intended. This is what we believed to be negotiating. And that's what forms this legitimacy into a settler presence in the territory, without which it's all still 100% Anishinaabe territory. So either come to our understanding or there is none.
Thank you.
Those are big words, but
And thanks. We have a few people who put some links in. Thanks, Kelly, for your link. And thanks for including the 4 questions from Justice Marie Sinclair. That's very helpful. I know in Manitoba Education, we're really looking at those questions to help us with some future curriculum documents to start us off on that thinking. So that really helps a lot. Any other questions that we've missed? I know that I'm getting messages from the organizers saying, please remember that there is another session starting for Winnipeg time, Manitoba time at 11:45 8:45, and obviously going east or west, you adjust your clocks from that time. And Jason, did you have anything to add at the end? And I'll look at the rest of the chat. There's two more.
Not at this point, just to say again, many thanks to Aileen for sharing her knowledge and speaking to us today. And I still have a lot of questions, but that'll have to wait for another time.
Thank you again for the invitation, and yeah, enjoy your time together. And hopefully some of this has sparked some thinking about how to teach differently and how to think differently about treaty. And it's going to take us some time to work through that. And I look forward to those conversations and those actions as we move forward. So miigwech.
Miigwech, thank you. And thanks to all the participants as well.